Throughout our study of the ancient world, we have often viewed the rise of humanity as a slow, linear progression from stone tools to the Silicon Age. However, a growing body of evidence suggests that we may be overlooking a significant chapter in the human story. Legends from nearly every early culture speak of a sophisticated society that existed before a great global deluge. This was not merely a tribe of hunter-gatherers, but a civilization that possessed a profound understanding of mathematics, engineering, and celestial mechanics. Some scholars hypothesize that their mastery of the heavens surpassed even our current comprehension. Today, we examine the possibility that an antediluvian empire reached for the stars long before the foundations of modern history were ever laid. We will analyze the silent witnesses left behind in stone and the astronomical alignments that point to a lost pinnacle of human achievement. To understand the heights of a civilization that may have traversed the heavens long before our recorded history, we must first look deep into the crust of our own planet. The standard narrative of human development is one of slow and linear progression. We are taught that humanity emerged from a primitive state of hunter-gatherers, slowly mastered the art of agriculture, and eventually discovered the secrets of metallurgy. In this traditional view, the transition from stone to bronze and then to iron took thousands of years of trial and error. However, a closer examination of the archaeological record and the geological strata of our world reveals anomalies that suggest a far more complex story. We find ourselves confronted with the possibility of a lost peak in human achievement, a period of technological brilliance that was silenced by a global cataclysm. This era, often referred to as the antediluvian period, refers to the time before the great floods mentioned in the oral and written traditions of nearly every ancient culture on Earth. The primary challenge in identifying a high-technology civilization from 10 or 12,000 years ago is the relentless nature of time and decay. If a modern city were abandoned today, the forces of nature would reclaim it with startling speed. Within a few centuries, the glass and concrete would crumble. Within a few millennia, the steel skeletons of our skyscrapers would oxidize and return to the earth as iron oxide or rust. After 10,000 years, almost nothing of our current industrial infrastructure would remain visible on the surface. This is why the search for the echo of antediluvian steel requires us to look for the indirect evidence of advanced tools and the chemical signatures of industrial processes that should not have existed according to our current understanding of the timeline. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence for the existence of advanced antediluvian metallurgy is found in the precision of ancient stone masonry. In various locations across the globe, from the high Andes of Peru to the Giza Plateau in Egypt, we find massive blocks of granite, basalt, and diorite cut with a precision that defies the capabilities of simple copper or bronze tools. Granite is one of the hardest stones on Earth. To cut it, shape it, and polish it with the level of accuracy seen at sites like Pumapunku or the Serapeum of Saqqara, one would need tools that are significantly harder than the stone itself. In modern times, we use diamond-tipped saws or high-carbon steel enriched with cobalt and tungsten to achieve such results. The presence of perfectly circular drill holes and saw marks that indicate a high rate of feed and pressure suggests that these ancient builders possessed mechanized tools powered by something more than human muscle. If these builders possessed such tools, they must have possessed the metallurgical knowledge to create them. Steel is an alloy of iron and carbon, and its production requires a sophisticated understanding of temperature control and chemical composition. To create high-quality steel, one must reach temperatures exceeding 1500 degrees Celsius. This is not a feat that can be accomplished in a simple campfire or a primitive clay kiln. It requires forced air systems, specialized crucibles, and a consistent supply of high-quality fuel. The existence of precision-cut stone from the deep past serves as a proxy for the existence of the steel tools that must have created them. Even if the tools themselves have long since rusted away into nothingness, their fingerprints remain etched forever in the hardest rocks of our world. Furthermore, we must consider the chemical and isotopic anomalies found in the geological record. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, there have been numerous reports of metallic objects found embedded in coal seams or encased in solid rock layers that are millions of years old. While many of these accounts are dismissed as hoaxes or misinterpretations, a few have undergone rigorous scientific scrutiny. For example, the discovery of iron artifacts with unusual compositions, such as a high percentage of nickel or a lack of common impurities, suggests a level of smelting and refining that was supposed to be impossible for ancient peoples. These objects, sometimes called out-of-place artifacts, hint at a global industrial presence that predates our current civilization. The concept of a pre-flood industrial peak also explains the sudden appearance of advanced knowledge at the beginning of the known historical period. When the Sumerians and the Egyptians first appeared on the stage of history, they did so with fully developed systems of writing, mathematics, law, and engineering. It is as if they inherited a legacy of knowledge from a predecessor. If we accept the possibility of an antediluvian civilization that had mastered metallurgy and steel production, we can then begin to ask how far that technology progressed. Steel is the foundational material for almost all advanced machinery. It is the core of the steam engine, the internal combustion engine, and the structural frame of modern aerospace vehicles. If a civilization reaches the point where it can produce high-carbon steel and precision machined components, the leap to electricity and advanced propulsion is not as far as it might seem. We must ask if the myths of flying machines, such as the Vimanas described in ancient Indian texts, are merely flights of fancy or if they are the distorted memories of a technological reality. These texts describe craft made of metal that could travel through the atmosphere and even into the void between the stars. While this sounds like science fiction, the consistency of these descriptions across different cultures suggests a shared observation of a real phenomenon. The destruction of such a civilization would have been nearly total. A global flood or a series of cometary impacts would have triggered massive tsunamis, volcanic eruptions, and tectonic shifts. The coastal cities, where most industrial centers are located, would have been pulverized and buried under hundreds of feet of silt and debris. The remaining steel structures would have been subjected to the corrosive power of salt water and oxygen, accelerating their decay. Over thousands of years, the weight of the new geological layers would crush and deform any remaining hollow structures. What we are left with are the echoes. We find these echoes in the anomalous isotopes found in ice cores, which show spikes in heavy metals that correspond to the end of the last ice age. We find them in the vitrified ruins of ancient forts and cities where the stone has been melted into glass, a process that requires temperatures comparable to those found in modern industrial furnaces or even nuclear reactions. As we investigate the silent witnesses left behind in stone, we must maintain an objective perspective. The absence of a large-scale fossil record for machines does not prove they never existed. It only proves that the Earth is an efficient recycler of human vanity. The steel that might have once formed the hull of a ship destined for the moon would today be nothing more than a thin layer of red dust, indistinguishable from the natural iron oxides in the soil. To find the truth, we must look for the patterns. We must look at the alignment of the great monuments to the stars, which suggests that the people who built them had a deep and precise understanding of astronomy. This level of astronomical knowledge is usually accompanied by the tools of observation, such as lenses and fine mechanical instruments, which again require advanced metallurgy. In the academic community, there is a growing recognition that the timeline of human history may need to be pushed back significantly. The discovery of sites like Göbekli Tepe in Turkey has already proven that complex monumental architecture existed thousands of years earlier than previously thought. If humans were capable of carving and moving massive stone pillars 12,000 years ago, what else were they capable of? The echo of antediluvian steel is a call to look closer at the artifacts we have ignored and to reconsider the myths we have dismissed as mere stories. The possibility that a civilization reached the stars before the flood changes our understanding of our place in the universe. It suggests that progress is not a guaranteed upward trajectory, but a fragile cycle that can be broken by the whims of a volatile planet. If we are the descendants of a lost spacefaring culture, then our current drive to reach the Moon and Mars is not a new endeavor, but a long-delayed return to our former home. The steel we produce today is the same material that once reached for the heavens in a forgotten age. By studying the remnants of the past, we are not just looking at where we came from, but perhaps where we are destined to go once again. In the following sections, we will explore the specific metallurgical techniques that have been identified in ancient artifacts and the evidence for high-heat industrial processes that predate the Bronze Age. We will examine the microscopic evidence of precision machining and the chemical traces left behind in the earth that point toward a lost industrial revolution. This journey into the heart of the antediluvian world will challenge our preconceptions and force us to ask the ultimate question. If they were so advanced, why did they disappear? The answer may lie in the very stars they once sought to reach, and in the cataclysmic events that brought their golden age to a watery end. We are the inheritors of their silent legacy, and it is our task to decipher the code they left behind in the form of the echo of antediluvian steel. The study of this period requires a multidisciplinary approach, combining the rigor of materials science with the observational skills of archaeology and the contextual knowledge of history. We must analyze the stress patterns in ancient stone and the molecular structure of the rare metallic fragments that have survived. Each piece of the puzzle, no matter how small, brings us closer to visualizing the world as it was before the great horizon of the flood. It was a world of fire and forge, of logic and light, and a world where the cold glint of steel was the key to unlocking the secrets of the cosmos. As we peel back the layers of time, we find that the past is not a dark and primitive place, but a mirror reflecting a brilliance we are only now beginning to rediscover. To understand the trajectory of a civilization that has mastered its home planet, we must look beyond the simple tools of survival and toward the complex requirements of expansion. In the epoch preceding the great cataclysms recorded in global folklore, humanity reached a threshold where the terrestrial confines of Earth were no longer the boundary of their ambition, but rather the foundation for it. This period, which we shall call the Ascension, represents a paradigm shift from a planetary culture to a celestial one. It was a time when the infrastructure of the world was directed not toward the conquest of neighboring tribes, but toward the conquest of the heavens themselves. The fundamental catalyst for this expansion was likely a breakthrough in energy production and propulsion that differs significantly from our current reliance on chemical combustion. While modern aerospace engineering is defined by the explosive power of liquid hydrogen and oxygen, the evidence found in ancient technical descriptions suggests a mastery of resonance and electromagnetic harmonics. In the historical texts of the Indian subcontinent, specifically the Vaimanika Shastra, we encounter detailed descriptions of craft known as vimanas. These were not merely mythological flying carpets, but were described as complex machines constructed from specialized alloys, utilizing mercury vortex engines and sophisticated gyroscopic systems. From a historical perspective, these descriptions serve as a conceptual blueprint for a technology that prioritizes the manipulation of gravity over the brute force of thrust. The logistical center of this pre-Diluvian space program would have required a global network of energy distribution. This brings us to the controversial but compelling theory of the world grid. This hypothesis suggests that the placement of megalithic structures like the Giza Plateau, Stonehenge, and the ruins of Tiwanaku was not random or merely ritualistic. Instead, these sites may have functioned as nodes in a planetary power system, tapping into the telluric currents of the Earth to provide a wireless transmission of energy. For a civilization aiming for the stars, such a system would be essential. It would allow for the continuous powering of orbital launch platforms and the maintenance of a high-technology infrastructure without the need for localized fuel sources. As the civilization moved into the orbital environment, their relationship with the planet changed. The establishment of what we might call the Watcher Stations, referenced in the Book of Enoch and other apocryphal texts, indicates a permanent presence in the high atmosphere and beyond. These Watchers were not divine beings in the supernatural sense, but rather the administrative and technical personnel tasked with overseeing the planetary systems and the burgeoning celestial colonies. They inhabited orbital platforms that would have appeared to those on the ground as bright, unmoving stars or even small moons. This presence in the heavens allowed for a level of global communication and surveillance that mirrors our modern satellite networks, yet it was likely far more integrated into their daily governance. The motivation for this ascension was not merely curiosity. When we examine the geological records and the cyclical nature of solar activity, it is possible that the elite of this antediluvian society recognized the approaching instability of the Earth. Whether they foresaw a solar micronova, a crustal displacement, or a massive cometary impact, the drive to establish a presence off-world was a matter of species survival. The Moon, our closest celestial neighbor, would have been the logical first step for colonization. In many ancient traditions, the Moon is often described as being brought to the Earth or appearing during a specific golden age. While modern astronomy views the Moon as a natural satellite of immense age, the cultural memory of several civilizations, including the pre-Hellenic Greeks and the Chibcha of South America, speaks of a time before the Moon was visible in the night sky. This suggests a period of intense lunar activity, perhaps related to the construction of outposts or the terraforming of its surface. Furthermore, the construction of massive stone complexes on Earth can be viewed as the terrestrial support system for this celestial endeavor. The precision seen in the cutting of diorite and granite at Pumapunku or the lifting of the 1,000-ton trilithon stones at Baalbek suggests the use of heavy industrial machinery or perhaps acoustic levitation. In an academic context, we must ask why a civilization would expend such immense effort to move these stones. The answer may lie in the need for stability and durability. If one is building a spaceport or a resonance-based power plant designed to last for millennia, one does not use wood or steel, which rusts and decays. One uses the very bones of the Earth. These megalithic sites were the launch pads and the anchors of the ascension, designed to withstand both the passage of time and the environmental stresses of high-energy operations. The societal structure of this era would have been one of extreme stratification, likely governed by a technocratic elite who held the keys to the celestial gates. This is reflected in the near-universal myths of the god-kings who descended from the stars to bring civilization to humanity. In this model, these gods were not extraterrestrial in origin, but were the advanced survivors of the human race who had transitioned to an orbital or lunar existence. The gap between the starfaring elite and the terrestrial population would have been vast, creating a mythology of divine beings and mortal servants. This division of humanity is a recurring theme in ancient literature, where the residents of the sky are seen as possessing the secrets of immortality and the power of the thunderbolt, which we might recognize today as advanced directed energy weapons or high-voltage technology. The astronomical alignment of these ancient sites further reinforces the celestial focus of the period. The Great Pyramid of Giza is aligned to true north with a precision that exceeds modern architectural standards, and its internal shafts point toward specific star systems like Orion and Sirius. This was not merely for the purpose of timekeeping or astrology. It served as a physical manifestation of their navigational charts. For a civilization that has mastered space travel, the stars are not distant points of light but destinations and landmarks. The orientation of their most significant monuments toward these constellations suggests a deep and active connection to those regions of space, perhaps indicating the presence of further colonies or the origin points of their ancestors. As we consider the height of this civilization, we must also consider the psychological impact of what modern astronauts call the overview effect. Seeing the Earth as a fragile, unified whole from the vantage point of space would have fostered a global identity that transcended local geography. This may explain why we find such remarkable similarities in architecture, mathematics, and symbolism across continents that were supposedly isolated from one another. The winged disk, the serpent of wisdom, and the pyramidal form are universal icons of this era, representing the flight of the soul, or perhaps the ship, toward the sun and the stars. The peak of the ascension was characterized by a seamless integration of biology, technology, and spirit. It was a time when the human voice could move mountains through resonance and when the chariot of the gods could traverse the distance between the earth and the moon in a matter of hours. This was a civilization that had mastered the laws of physics to such a degree that they could manipulate the fabric of spacetime itself. They were no longer at the mercy of the elements. They had become the architects of their own destiny, shaping the world to their will and looking outward toward the infinite possibilities of the cosmos. However, such a height of power brings with it a profound fragility. A system that relies on a global energy grid and orbital infrastructure is highly susceptible to disruption. The very technology that allowed them to reach the stars also made them vulnerable to the shifting tides of the solar system. As they looked up at the stars they had claimed as their own, they may have been blind to the gathering shadows on their own horizon. The brilliance of the ascension was a golden age of unparalleled achievement, yet it stood on the brink of a transformation that would erase nearly every trace of its existence. The transition from a planetary master to a cosmic traveler was complete, but the ultimate test of this civilization was not their ability to leave the Earth, but their ability to survive the forces that the Earth was about to unleash. The legacy of this era remains etched in the stones that refuse to erode and the myths that refuse to die. We see it in the precision of the constellations carved into temple walls and in the persistent human yearning to return to the stars. It is a story of a species that refused to be grounded, that looked at the vastness of the night sky and saw not a void, but a home. The ascension was the moment when humanity truly became a celestial entity, marking a high point in our collective history that we are only now beginning to comprehend as we once again look toward the heavens with the same ambition and the same restless spirit of discovery. As the era of the ascension solidified, the focus of the pre-Diluvian civilization shifted from the pursuit of knowledge to the pursuit of absolute control. In the halls of the great academies, which were by then situated primarily on orbital platforms or within the lunar colonies, a new philosophy began to take root. This ideology, which historians often refer to as the doctrine of total sovereignty, posited that the physical laws of the universe were not boundaries to be respected, but challenges to be overcome. The arrogance that accompanied this belief system was not merely a character flaw of the ruling elite, it was the very engine of their industrial and scientific expansion. At the height of this period, the civilization had established a network of energy collection arrays that spanned the inner solar system. These structures, vast webs of crystalline mirrors and thermal collectors, channeled a near limitless supply of solar radiation back to Earth and its various colonies. For a time, it seemed as though the scarcity that had defined human history for millennia had been permanently eradicated. Energy was effectively free, leading to a surge in construction that transformed the face of the planet. Cities grew vertically, piercing the clouds with spires of glass and carbon fiber that served as docking ports for the thousands of vessels that moved between the surface and the stars. However, this transition to a space-faring existence created a profound sociological rift. A new class of citizens emerged, those born and raised in low gravity or within the sterilized environments of the orbital rings. These individuals began to view the Earth as a primitive resource rather than a sacred home. To the high wardens of the stars, the planet was a reservoir of raw materials and a heat sink for the massive industrial processes occurring in orbit. This detachment led to the implementation of the Atmospheric Regulation Project, an ambitious and ultimately disastrous attempt to manage the global climate for the sole purpose of maximizing agricultural output and industrial efficiency. The Atmospheric Regulation Project involved the deployment of billions of micro-resonators into the stratosphere. These devices could theoretically manipulate weather patterns by adjusting local pressure and humidity through precisely tuned electromagnetic frequencies. In the short term, the project was hailed as the greatest achievement in human history. Droughts were eliminated, and the deserts of the planet were turned into lush gardens. Yet, the cost of this artificial harmony was the suppression of the natural cycles of the Earth. By forcing the atmosphere into a state of static perfection, the civilization was unknowingly building an immense reservoir of kinetic energy that had no natural outlet. While the sky was being tamed, the crust of the Earth was being subjected to even more invasive manipulations. The civilization had developed what they called the Lithospheric Stabilization Initiative. Because their massive cities required absolute geological stability, they engineered systems to lock tectonic plates in place. They used deep crustal injections and massive dampening arrays to prevent earthquakes and volcanic eruptions. To the scientists of the day, this was seen as the ultimate victory over a chaotic planet. From a geological perspective, however, this was akin to holding back a tidal wave with a wooden fence. The internal heat and pressure of the Earth, which naturally dissipates through tectonic movement and volcanic activity, was being bottled up. The first signs of the gathering storm were not recognized as such. Reports of strange seismic tremors began to filter in from the deep ocean floor, far from the stabilized urban centers. These were dismissed as minor anomalies or the settling of the crust. In the sky, the northern and southern lights began to appear at lower latitudes, shimmering with an intensity that disrupted the navigation systems of the orbital shuttles. These aurora events were the first indicators that the planetary magnetic field was being stressed by the massive energy transfers between the surface and the solar arrays. Academic records from this period, preserved in the most resilient data crystals recovered from the ruins, reveal a growing concern among a small group of dissident scholars. These individuals, often referred to as the preservationists, argued that the civilization was treating the planet as a machine rather than a living system. They warned that the suppression of natural geological and atmospheric venting would eventually lead to a catastrophic release of energy. They pointed to the rising temperature of the oceans, which were absorbing the excess heat from the atmospheric regulators, and the strange behavior of the deep Earth mantle. These warnings were largely ignored by the governing councils. The political structure of the time had become incredibly rigid, dominated by a technocratic elite who believed that any problem created by technology could be solved with more technology. When the weather patterns began to break down, they simply deployed more resonators. When the tremors increased, they strengthened the stabilization arrays. This feedback loop of technological intervention only served to accelerate the instability. The cultural output of this era also reflects a sense of growing unease. The art and literature of the late Ascension period transitioned from celebratory themes of cosmic expansion to more somber, existential reflections. There was a sense of waiting for a shoe to drop, a collective intuition that the level of prosperity they enjoyed was unsustainable. Some historians believe that this period saw the rise of various survivalist cults who began to build subterranean shelters or hidden enclaves in the high mountains, sensing that the orbital cities would be the first to fall if the energy networks collapsed. By the time the Great Resonance began, it was too late to reverse the damage. The Great Resonance was a phenomenon where the electromagnetic frequencies used for atmospheric control began to harmonize with the natural vibrations of the Earth core. This was not a localized event, but a global one. The sky began to vibrate with a low, humming sound that could be felt in the very bones of every living creature. This was the sound of the planet struggling against its constraints. The energy that had been suppressed for decades was reaching a critical mass. In the final years before the flood, the civilization was at its most decadent and its most vulnerable. They had built a world of wonders, but it was a world built on a foundation of suppressed chaos. The orbital rings were crowded with millions of people, while the surface was a meticulously manicured landscape that was essentially a pressure cooker. The social divide had reached a breaking point, with the surface populations becoming increasingly reliant on the orbital elite for food and energy, while the orbital elite grew more insulated and indifferent to the deteriorating conditions on the ground. The final trigger is still a matter of academic debate. Some researchers suggest that a massive solar flare interacted with the planetary energy grid, causing a systemic failure of all stabilization systems at once. Others argue that the internal pressure of the Earth simply reached a point where the crust could no longer hold. Regardless of the specific cause, the result was a simultaneous failure of the atmospheric regulators and the tectonic dampeners. The storm that followed was not a natural weather event, but a total systemic collapse of the planetary environment. The gathering storm was both literal and metaphorical. As the first massive hurricanes began to form, larger and more powerful than anything seen in recorded history, the political and social structures of the civilization also began to disintegrate. Communication between the colonies and the Earth was severed as the ionosphere became a chaotic mess of electrical discharges. The very technology that had allowed humanity to reach the stars was now acting as a conductor for the destruction of their home. This was the moment of reckoning for the pre-Diluvian world, the point where their celestial hubris finally met the unstoppable force of the natural world they had tried so hard to conquer. As we examine the ruins of these great structures and translate the final desperate messages of their scientists, we see a mirror of our own ambitions. The story of the pre-Diluvian civilization is a cautionary tale about the limits of engineering and the dangers of losing our connection to the fundamental rhythms of our planet. They were a people who could move mountains and touch the stars, but they forgot that they were still, at their core, children of the Earth, subject to the same laws of balance and consequence that govern all life in the cosmos. The gathering storm was the inevitable result of a civilization that had grown too large and too arrogant for its own world, setting the stage for the great flood that would wash away their achievements and reset the clock of human history. The transition from the peak of their power to the brink of their destruction happened with terrifying speed. In a matter of a few generations, the master of the heavens became the victims of the very environment they had sought to dominate. The technological infrastructure that had supported billions began to crumble, leaving a population that had forgotten the skills of survival to face the fury of a planet in revolt. It is in this period of chaotic transition that we find the most profound lessons for our own future as we once again stand on the threshold of becoming a truly celestial civilization. The stratigraphic record shows a sharp increase in volcanic ash and sedimentary deposits during this window, indicating a period of extreme geological activity. In the ice cores recovered from the deepest layers of the Antarctic, we see chemical signatures that do not match any known natural volcanic event, suggesting the release of artificial compounds during the collapse of the atmospheric arrays. These physical markers tell a story of a world in agony, a planet tearing itself apart to shed the artificial constraints imposed upon it by its most ambitious inhabitants. The hubris of the pre-Diluvian people had reached its limit, and the storm was about to break in a way that would change the world forever. The end of this segment brings us to the very edge of the catastrophe. The civilization stands at the precipice, their technology failing and the natural world rising up in a tidal wave of suppressed energy. The stars they once walked among are now distant and unreachable, as the atmosphere turns into a wall of fire and water. The stage is set for the final chapter of this lost era, the moment when the waters rose and the memory of the celestial hubris was buried beneath the waves. The stability of the antediluvian world was not merely a matter of social order or technological prowess. It was predicated on a delicate geological and atmospheric equilibrium that modern science struggles to reconstruct. For centuries, according to the fragmented records and oral traditions of diverse cultures, the Earth existed under a protective canopy, a state of environmental grace that allowed for longevity and the unhindered advancement of a global civilization. This era of peace and progress, characterized by its reach toward the heavens, came to a sudden and violent conclusion. The event referred to in ancient texts as the breaking of the fountains of the deep was not a gradual change in climate, but a systemic failure of the planet itself. It was the moment the very foundation of their high technology and their celestial ambitions were washed away by a force of nature that no amount of engineering could withstand. To understand the magnitude of this catastrophe, we must first examine the subterranean structure of the pre-flood world. Many theoretical models suggest that the Earth was once characterized by vast, pressurized reservoirs of water trapped beneath the granite crust. These subterranean oceans, held in place by the weight of the continents above, provided a stable source of thermal regulation and mineral-rich springs. However, as the civilization reached its zenith, the geological pressure within these chambers reached a critical threshold. Whether triggered by tectonic shifts, solar flares, or the environmental impact of the civilization itself, the result was a catastrophic rupture of the planetary crust. The day the fountains broke, the crust of the Earth did not merely crack, it shattered. Imagine a global rift system that tore through the oceans and the continents with the speed of sound. This was not a standard earthquake but a longitudinal failure of the entire lithosphere. As the pressure was released, massive jets of superheated water and steam were propelled high into the atmosphere, some even reaching the upper reaches of the exosphere. This geyser-like eruption would have been visible from space, a literal fountain of the deep shooting through the very sky that the civilization had sought to conquer. This discharge carried with it millions of tons of sediment and debris, instantly turning the clear blue of the pre-flood sky into a churning vortex of gray and black. As these jets of water reached the cold vacuum of the upper atmosphere, they condensed and froze, falling back to Earth not as gentle rain, but as a torrential downpour of unprecedented volume. This is the origin of the 40 days and 40 nights of rain described in historical accounts. However, this was not a weather pattern in the traditional sense. It was the collapse of the atmospheric canopy itself. The water that had once provided a protective barrier against solar radiation and maintained a greenhouse-like stability across the globe was now being reclaimed by gravity. This atmospheric collapse created a pressure change so sudden that it would have disrupted the flight systems and energy grids of an advanced society almost instantly. The civilization that reached the stars was particularly vulnerable to this type of aquatic cataclysm. Their infrastructure, likely built on the assumption of geological stability and maritime dominance, was concentrated along coastal regions and strategic river valleys. When the fountains of the deep broke, the initial tsunamis were not measured in feet, but in miles of height. The displacement of the ocean floors and the eruption of subterranean water created massive waves that swept across the continents at hundreds of miles per hour. These were not mere surges of water. They were slurry-like mixtures of rock, mud, and vegetation that acted like a giant abrasive, scouring the surface of the earth clean. The grand architecture, the silver spires, and the sophisticated launch platforms were not just flooded, they were pulverized. In the first hours of the disaster, the global communications network would have failed. The satellites or orbital stations that served as the eyes and ears of this civilization would have watched helplessly as the planet below turned into a chaotic mass of water and cloud. The power plants, which might have relied on geophysical or atmospheric energy, would have been short-circuited by the rising tides and the deluge from above. The people of that era, accustomed to a world where they had mastered the elements, found themselves suddenly humbled by a power they could not calculate or control. The pride of their achievements, their celestial hubris, was met with the absolute indifference of a planetary reset. The geological evidence for this event remains a subject of intense academic debate. Historians and geologists who look at the massive sedimentary layers found across every continent see signs of a rapid, high-energy deposition of materials. In many places, we find what are known as megabreccias, which are layers containing massive boulders and shattered remnants of stone that could only have been moved by water of incredible velocity. These layers often sit directly atop the remains of ancient landscapes, sealing them away from the reach of time. The very soil we walk upon is, in many ways, the graveyard of the world that existed before the fountains broke. As the waters rose, the geography of the earth was fundamentally rewritten. The sudden release of subterranean water led to the collapse of the landmasses into the newly emptied chambers below. This triggered massive tectonic shifts, causing the ocean floors to sink and the mountain ranges to buckle and rise. The peaks we see today, such as the Himalayas or the Andes, may have been thrust upward during this period of intense crustal readjustment. The world that emerged from the waves was a different place entirely, with new coastlines, different climates, and a landscape that bore little resemblance to the garden-like paradise of the pre-flood era. The psychological impact on the survivors cannot be overstated. For those few who were positioned to survive, either through foreknowledge or sheer providence, the sight of their global civilization being erased in a matter of weeks must have been paralyzing. The knowledge of the stars, the intricate mathematics of their energy systems, and the history of their ancestors were largely lost. They were transitioned from a world of high technology and abundance to a world of mud and survival. This is why we see such a sharp divide in the historical record between the sophisticated myths of the antediluvian world and the primitive, struggling beginnings of the post-flood civilizations. The bridge between the two was burned by the heat of the fountains and washed away by the depths of the sea. In the academic study of this period, we must also consider the loss of biological diversity. The pre-flood world, with its stable environment, likely hosted a much wider array of flora and fauna than we see today. The catastrophe was a biological bottleneck. Many species that were integrated into the civilization or lived in its unique ecosystems were rendered extinct. The loss of genetic information was as profound as the loss of technological information. When the waters finally receded, the Earth was a sterile, bruised version of its former self, waiting for the slow process of repopulation and the eventual rediscovery of its own history. The story of the fountains of the deep is a reminder of the fragility of even the most advanced societies. It challenges the notion that progress is a linear and unbreakable path. The civilization of that era had reached for the stars, perhaps believing they had transcended the limitations of their terrestrial home. But they were ultimately bound to the Earth, and when the Earth changed, their entire world disappeared. The sediment that covers their ruins is a silent witness to the day the sky fell and the oceans rose. It serves as a somber conclusion to the era of celestial hubris, marking the boundary between a forgotten golden age and the long, difficult journey of the humanity that followed. The memory of this day was etched into the collective consciousness of every culture on Earth, preserved in the flood myths that appear in every corner of the globe, from the high mountains of the east to the plains of the west. It is a story of a day when the Earth reclaimed its own, and the stars were suddenly very far away. The collapse of a global civilization does not usually happen in a single afternoon, yet the evidence surrounding the antediluvian catastrophe suggests that for the people of that era, the end was shockingly swift. To understand the transition from a starfaring society to a world submerged in water, we must examine the mechanics of what we call the Great Drowning. This was not merely a period of heavy rain, but a systemic failure of both planetary and orbital systems that had been maintained with precision for centuries. As the technological safeguards failed, the very infrastructure that had allowed humanity to reach for the stars began to fall back to Earth, literally and figuratively. The first signs of the coming disaster were likely observed by the technicians stationed in high Earth orbit. For generations, this civilization had maintained a complex network of orbital mirrors, power stations, and habitable rings. These structures were designed to regulate the climate and provide limitless energy to the cities below. However, data suggests that a significant gravitational disturbance, perhaps the close passage of a celestial body or a massive solar event, began to perturb these orbits. In an interconnected system, a small deviation in one sector can lead to a cascading failure. The precise balance required to keep millions of tons of steel and composite materials aloft was lost. As these massive structures began to lose their velocity, their orbits decayed, bringing them into the upper reaches of the atmosphere. The re-entry of orbital debris was the opening act of the drowning. As these enormous structures began to burn up upon re-entry, they did not simply disappear. The sheer volume of material added an immense amount of thermal energy to the atmosphere. This sudden heating caused a rapid evaporation of the polar ice caps and a massive release of water vapor from the oceans. Historians often speak of the sky falling, and in a literal sense, the fire from the heavens provided the catalyst for the water that would soon follow. The increased thermal load caused the atmospheric pressure to fluctuate wildly, creating supercells and storms of a magnitude that the modern world has never witnessed. While the sky was filled with the fire of falling stations, the earth beneath was responding with equal violence. The theory of crustal displacement suggests that the massive redistribution of weight, caused by the melting ice and the shifting of tectonic plates, triggered a global seismic event. In the ancient texts of various cultures, this is often described as the fountains of the great deep being broken up. From a geological perspective, this refers to the rupturing of the oceanic crust and the release of subterranean water reservoirs. The pressure from the mantle, combined with the shifting of the plates, forced massive quantities of water upward, meeting the torrential rains that were falling from the saturated atmosphere. For the coastal megacities of the antediluvian world, there was no defense against the rising tide. These cities were the hubs of trade, technology, and government. They were built with the assumption of a stable sea level, protected by advanced seawalls and tidal energy barriers. However, when the mega-tsunamis began, triggered by the collapse of orbital fragments into the deep ocean, these defenses were bypassed in minutes. The kinetic energy of a mountain-sized piece of orbital debris hitting the Pacific or Atlantic Ocean would have sent a wall of water hundreds of feet high racing toward the shorelines. These were not waves in the traditional sense, but moving mountains of water that carried the force of thousands of megatons. As the cities were submerged, the global data grid went dark. This civilization was entirely dependent on a seamless flow of information. Their economy, their logistics, and even their basic survival systems were managed by artificial intelligences housed in centralized hubs. When the water reached these hubs, the civilization was effectively lobotomized. Communication between the colonies on Mars or the Moon and the home planet was severed. Imagine the terror of those on the lunar bases, looking down at a blue planet that was suddenly obscured by a thick, turbulent layer of gray clouds and the glowing embers of their falling orbital brothers. They were watching the death of their mother world in real time, knowing that without the constant stream of supplies and instructions from Earth, their own days were numbered. The Great Drowning also fundamentally altered the geography of the planet. The weight of the water and the shifting of the plates caused entire landmasses to sink while others were thrust upward. The legendary continent of Atlantis, often dismissed as myth, might have been a victim of this specific geological realignment. When we look at the bathymetric maps of the ocean floor today, we see strange formations that look remarkably like drowned cityscapes and process canals. These are often buried under miles of silt and sediment, deposited during the violent churning of the floodwaters. The speed of the sedimentation was so great that it preserved the remains of this high technology in a way that traditional slow erosion never could. It is a massive underwater tomb. The academic community often struggles with the time frame of this event. Conventional archaeology suggests a slow rise in sea levels following the last glacial maximum, but the physical evidence of the drowning points to a far more abrupt incident. We see evidence of mass extinctions where animals and humans were swept away and buried in tangled heaps, mixed with broken machinery and shattered stone. This is not the result of a rising tide over centuries, but a catastrophic inundation that happened in a matter of days or weeks. The biological record shows a sudden drop in population across all species, a bottleneck that nearly wiped out the human race. In the midst of this chaos, the elite of the antediluvian world attempted to use their technology to escape. There are accounts in various ancient traditions of great ships or arks, but we should not view these solely as wooden boats. If a civilization possessed the ability to build orbital rings, their version of an ark would have been a highly advanced submersible or a self-sustaining biosphere. However, even the most advanced technology has limits. The turbulence of the oceans and the constant bombardment from the sky made survival a matter of luck rather than engineering. Many of these survival vessels were likely crushed by the pressure or buried under the collapsing seafloor. The psychological impact on the survivors cannot be overstated. They went from a world where they had conquered gravity and time to a world where they were fighting for a dry piece of ground. The loss of the stars was perhaps the most painful part of the drowning. For a people who were used to looking up and seeing their own lights reflected in the orbital stations, the new sky was a terrifying void of storm and darkness. The stars, which had once been destinations, were now unreachable beacons of a lost age. This transition marks the end of the Age of Light and the beginning of the long, dark struggle for basic survival. As the waters finally began to recede, or rather, as the Earth found its new equilibrium, the world that emerged was unrecognizable. The lush, high-tech paradise was gone, replaced by a mud-caked wilderness. The great works of art, the libraries of digital knowledge, and the factories of wonders were all buried deep beneath the new ocean floor or under layers of sedimentary rock. The survivors were scattered, isolated, and stripped of the tools they needed to rebuild. They were a people with the memories of gods but the resources of scavengers. The Great Drowning was the ultimate reset button for terrestrial life. It erased the footprints of a civilization that had grown too ambitious, or perhaps a civilization that had simply failed to account for the fragility of their planetary home. When we study the layers of silt and the ancient stories of the deluge, we are not just looking at a natural disaster. We are looking at the tombstone of a global empire. The sinking orbits were the final curtains closing on the first act of the human story, leaving only the echoes of their greatness to be whispered in the myths of the cultures that followed. The water did more than just kill, it hid the truth, leaving the next cycle of humanity to wonder if they were truly the first to reach for the stars. In the next segment, we will explore how the remnants of this shattered world attempted to preserve what little they could, giving rise to the mystery of the megaliths and the strange commonalities found in the world's oldest civilizations. When we examine the stratigraphic record of our planet, we find a period of profound geological instability that coincides with the end of the last great ice age. For the modern historian and the geologist alike, this era represents a chaotic transition. However, when we look closer at the layers of sediment deposited during this time, we encounter anomalies that challenge the conventional timeline of human development. In various locations across the globe, buried under meters of dense river silt and marine clay, lie structures of such immense scale and precision that they appear to be the remnants of a forgotten epoch of high technology. These are the monoliths beneath the silt, the silent witnesses to a civilization that understood the stars long before the first recorded pharaohs or kings. The presence of these structures suggests that the pre-flood world was not merely a collection of hunter-gatherer tribes. Instead, we find evidence of an organized, global effort to monumentalize specific geographic points with astronomical precision. One of the most striking examples of this phenomenon can be found in the excavations of sites that were intentionally buried or covered by the rapid accumulation of sediment following catastrophic flooding events. When archaeologists dig through these layers of silt, they are essentially peeling back the pages of a lost history book. The silt acts as a preservative, shielding the fine details of the masonry from the erosive forces of wind and rain. What emerges is a picture of architectural mastery that defies the capabilities of the primitive tools usually attributed to this period. In the mountains of southeastern Turkey, the site known as Göbekli Tepe offers a profound look into this mystery. While often cited as the oldest temple in the world, its most significant feature is not its age, but its sophistication. The pillars found there are massive, T-shaped monoliths carved from single blocks of limestone, some weighing over 10 tons. They are arranged in precise circles, many of which are decorated with high-relief carvings of animals and celestial symbols. Most fascinating to the academic observer is the fact that the oldest layers are the most advanced. As time progressed, the quality of the masonry declined until the site was finally buried by human hands, preserved under a mound of earth and refuse. Why would a civilization go to such lengths to hide their greatest achievements? One theory suggests that they were attempting to protect their knowledge from an impending global catastrophe, creating a time capsule for future generations to discover. Further south, in the Nile Valley, the traditional narrative of the Great Pyramids and the Sphinx is being reconsidered in light of geological evidence. While traditional archaeology dates the Sphinx to the era of the Old Kingdom, several geologists have pointed to the deep, undulating erosion patterns on the enclosure walls. These patterns are characteristic of heavy, prolonged rainfall, a climate condition that has not existed on the Giza Plateau for thousands of years prior to the rise of the Egyptian state. This suggests that the core of the monument was carved much earlier, perhaps at a time when the Sahara was a lush, green landscape. If the Sphinx and the lower levels of the megalithic temples nearby were indeed standing before the Great Flood, they would have been submerged under the rising waters and the massive amounts of silt carried by the swollen river. Indeed, when the first modern explorers cleared the sand from these sites, they found layers of salt and sediment that spoke of a watery past. The engineering required to move and set these stones is another point of intense academic debate. At the site of Baalbek in modern-day Lebanon, the trilithon consists of 3 massive stones, each weighing approximately 800 tons. They are positioned perfectly in a foundation wall that sits far below the later Roman construction. Standard archaeological explanations involve wooden rollers and massive labor forces, yet these methods struggle to account for the sheer scale and the precise placement of the blocks. Some researchers propose that the prehistoric builders utilized advanced understanding of physics and harmonics, or perhaps high-precision cutting tools that have long since vanished. The precision of the joints between these stones is often so tight that a human hair cannot pass between them, a feat that requires modern industrial machinery to replicate. When we look toward the coastal regions, the evidence for a submerged pre-flood civilization becomes even more compelling. During the melting of the ice sheets, sea levels rose by more than 100 meters, drowning vast areas of the continental shelves that were once fertile plains. In the Gulf of Khumbat off the coast of India, sonar mapping has revealed the outlines of massive cities stretching for miles along the seabed. These ruins sit under 30 meters of water and are covered by thick layers of river silt. Marine archaeologists have recovered artifacts and worked wood from these sites that date back over 9,000 years, far older than the Indus Valley civilization. These submerged cities were likely the coastal hubs of a global network, strategically placed for maritime trade and astronomical observation. The celestial connection is perhaps the most significant aspect of these monoliths. Almost every major megalithic site discovered beneath the silt or sand is aligned with remarkable accuracy to specific stars or solar events. The Great Pyramid of Giza is oriented to true north within a fraction of a degree. The pillars of Göbekli Tepe appear to track the movement of the constellation Cygnus or the position of the winter solstice. This level of precision suggests that the builders were not just concerned with terrestrial architecture, but were mapping the heavens. They possessed an advanced knowledge of the precession of the equinoxes, a slow wobble of the Earth's axis that takes over 25,000 years to complete one cycle. To understand and calculate this movement, a civilization must be capable of maintaining records over thousands of years, implying a high level of literacy and mathematical skill. In the Americas, the site of Tiwanaku in the Bolivian Andes sits at an altitude of nearly 4,000 meters. Here, the Gate of the Sun and the Kalasasaya Temple display sophisticated masonry and astronomical alignments that correlate with the positions of the stars as they appeared over 10,000 years ago. Geologists have noted that the site shows signs of having been hit by a massive flood of water and mud coming from the nearby Lake Titicaca. The sediment layers covering the lower portions of the ruins contain fragments of marine shells and deep-sea silt, despite being miles above sea level. This suggests a cataclysmic event of such magnitude that it displaced the very waters of the lake, burying the city in a thick shroud of earth. As we analyze these various sites, a pattern begins to emerge. We see a civilization that was obsessed with the concept of permanence. They did not build with wood or brick, which rot and crumble over centuries. They built with the hardest stones available, such as granite, basalt, and andesite. They shaped these stones with a level of geometric precision that suggests a profound understanding of mathematics and potentially the use of mechanized tools. By burying their most important works or placing them in locations that would survive the rising tides, they ensured that the physical evidence of their existence would endure long after their culture had vanished. The academic community is slowly beginning to acknowledge that the traditional cradle of civilization in Mesopotamia may have been a late blooming successor to a much older, more advanced world. The silt that covered these monoliths acted as a barrier to our understanding for centuries, leading us to believe that human progress was a slow, linear climb from the cave to the city. However, the monoliths beneath the silt suggest a different story. They tell of a high point in human achievement that was abruptly ended by a global disaster, followed by a long period of amnesia and recovery. The survivors of this disaster would have been left with the monumental ruins of their ancestors, remnants of a time when humanity reached for the stars and mastered the earth. To study these monoliths is to study the survivors' attempts to rebuild. In the wake of the flood, the knowledge of advanced technology may have been lost, but the memory of the principles remained. This explains why we find similar architectural styles and mythological motifs across cultures that were supposedly separated by vast oceans and thousands of years. From the stepped pyramids of Mexico to the ziggurats of Iraq and the temples of Southeast Asia, the blueprint remains the same. They were all attempting to recreate the glory of the world that was buried beneath the silt. As we continue to use modern technology such as ground-penetrating radar and satellite imagery, more of these sites are coming to light. We are finding that the Earth is covered in the scars of its violent past, and that those scars often hide the foundations of a forgotten reality. The monoliths are not just piles of stone. They are data storage devices, carved in the language of geometry and light, waiting for a generation with the right tools to decode them. The more we uncover, the more we realize that our ancestors were not the primitive people we once thought they were. They were architects of the world, builders of the heavens, and their legacy is only now beginning to resurface from the depths of the Earth's dark and silent sediment. To understand the nature of the star-born inheritance, we must first look beyond the physical ruins and examine the intellectual architecture that survived the global cataclysm. When the waters receded and the dust of a broken world settled, humanity did not restart from a blank slate. Instead, they carried with them the fragmented blueprints of a civilization that had mastered the laws of the universe. This inheritance was not merely a collection of tools or artifacts, but a profound understanding of mathematics, astronomy, and biology that would shape the rise of every subsequent great power, from the Nile Valley to the high Andes. The most visible aspect of this inheritance is found in the sudden, sophisticated emergence of astronomical knowledge in civilizations that supposedly lacked the tools for such precision. We see it in the preoccupation with the precession of the equinoxes, a slow celestial cycle that takes nearly 26,000 years to complete. For a primitive culture to recognize this cycle, they would require centuries of recorded observations and an advanced grasp of spherical trigonometry. Yet, the earliest recorded histories of the Sumerians and the Egyptians already contain these values as foundational truths. It is highly probable that this data was a gift from the antediluvian era, a celestial map handed down to ensure that future generations would always know where they stood in relation to the stars. The star-born inheritance also manifested in the curious uniformity of mathematical constants used across the globe. We find the same sacred geometry in the layout of the Great Pyramid of Giza as we do in the temples of Cambodia and the sun gates of Bolivia. These structures often encode the dimensions of the Earth, the distance to the Moon, and the velocity of light within their proportions. In an academic sense, this suggests a standardized system of weights and measures that was established long before the dawn of documented history. This system was not developed in isolation by separate nomadic tribes, but was instead a standardized curriculum provided by the survivors of the high civilization. Furthermore, we must address the biological component of this legacy. Many ancient texts, which we often dismiss as mere mythology, speak of a time when the kings were of a different lineage, described as having long lives and superior intellects. In the Sumerian king list, the reigns of the first monarchs are said to have lasted for thousands of years. While modern historians often interpret these numbers as symbolic or hyperbolic, a more literal reading suggests a genetic inheritance. If the pre-flood civilization had reached the stars, it stands to reason they had also mastered the complexities of the human genome. The inheritance may have included life extension technologies or specific genetic markers designed to preserve higher consciousness through periods of environmental collapse. This biological link is often represented by the recurring motif of the culture hero or the seven sages. Across various cultures, stories tell of mysterious individuals who appeared after the Great Flood to teach humanity the arts of agriculture, writing, and metallurgy. These figures, such as Oannes in Mesopotamia or Viracocha in Peru, are frequently described as emerging from the sea or descending from the sky. They are the conduits of the star-born inheritance. They did not just bring seeds to plant. They brought the systematic logic of civilization. They functioned as living libraries, preserving the technical expertise of a society that had once walked among the heavens. The transmission of this knowledge was rarely direct or complete. As the centuries passed, the high science of the star-born ancestors was often distilled into ritual and religion. The precise calculations of orbital mechanics were simplified into calendars for farming, and the sophisticated understanding of energy frequencies was reduced to the use of incense and chanting. However, the core of the inheritance remained buried within the traditions of the priesthoods and secret societies. These groups viewed themselves as the guardians of a lost flame, waiting for a time when humanity would again be capable of understanding the true nature of their ancestors. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence for this inheritance is the sudden appearance of advanced metallurgy. The transition from the Stone Age to the Bronze Age is often depicted as a slow evolutionary step. Yet, in certain regions, we find evidence of high-temperature smelting and the creation of alloys that require an incredible degree of chemical knowledge. The use of meteoric iron and the precision cutting of hard stones like diorite and basalt suggest that the survivors were using remnant technologies from the star-born era. They were not discovering these techniques for the first time. They were attempting to replicate the industrial capabilities of a fallen world using whatever resources they could find in the mud. Language itself may be a part of this inheritance. Linguists have long noted the existence of a proto-world language, a common root that seems to underpin the most ancient spoken tongues. This primordial language often contains technical terms for celestial bodies and complex philosophical concepts that seem out of place for the era. If the pre-flood civilization was a global, star-faring society, they would have likely utilized a unified language for trade, science, and governance. The confusion of tongues described in various traditions may reflect the fragmentation of this global linguistic heritage, as the survivors scattered and became isolated by the rising oceans. We should also consider the physical inheritance of the time capsules. There are persistent accounts of hidden chambers and halls of records located deep beneath the earth, or within indestructible stone monuments. These sites were intended to serve as repositories for the most vital information and technology of the star-born civilization. From the legend of the Emerald Tablets to the rumored chambers beneath the Sphinx, the narrative remains consistent. The ancestors knew that a time of darkness was coming, and they took great pains to ensure that the spark of their genius would not be completely extinguished. They were not just leaving behind monuments to their vanity. They were leaving behind survival kits for their descendants. The star-born inheritance is also found in the very concept of the city-state. The idea of an organized urban environment with sanitation, irrigation, and centralized administration appears almost fully formed in the archaeological record. There is no evidence of a long period of trial and error leading up to the construction of the first cities in the Indus Valley or Mesopotamia. Instead, they appear as if they were built according to a pre-existing plan. This urban blueprint is a social inheritance, a memory of how a high-population society must be managed to maintain order and prosperity. It is a reflection of the sophisticated social engineering practiced by the star-born civilization. As we look at the progress of modern humanity, we are forced to ask if we are truly inventing anything new or if we are simply recovering the star-born inheritance bit by bit. Our current trek into space, our mastery of the atom, and our mapping of the human genome bear a striking resemblance to the capabilities attributed to the ancestors. If the star-born inheritance is real, then our history is not a linear climb from the cave to the stars. Instead, it is a cyclical journey of forgetting and remembering. We are the heirs to a legacy that we are only now beginning to comprehend, a legacy that was written in the stars and carved into the very bones of the earth. This inheritance serves as both a gift and a warning. It provides us with the tools to transcend our planetary limitations, but it also reminds us of the fragility of even the most advanced societies. The star-born civilization reached the pinnacle of achievement, yet they could not escape the cycles of nature and the eventual reset of the world. By reclaiming this inheritance, we are not just looking back at our past. We are looking at our potential future. We are learning that we are a species with amnesia, slowly waking up in a house built by giants, and finding that the keys to the universe have been in our hands all along. The study of the star-born inheritance is therefore the most important task of the modern historian, for it is the study of who we were and who we are destined to become once again.